But I wanted to say welcome. My name is Amy Elias. I'm the director of the UT Humanities Center, and this is One Health and Humanities Days. It's a partnership between the Humanities Center and the Systems UT One Health Initiative. With Deb Miller, the director here today, we're really happy that you came. And One Health is a holistic approach to health that includes planetary, animal, and human health, with the understanding that those things are wedded together in a way that can't be separated. And so we have to talk about a holistic system of health whenever we talk about human flourishing or planetary flourishing. I direct you to other events that we have going on this afternoon. I hope you can make them. The next one is at, I'm gonna get the times right, at 5:30 to 7:30 at the Friesen Black Cultural Center on campus. It's on Black maternal health. And it's a think tank panel. They've been meeting over the course of the semester, which will include, I think, 5 or 6 community members, as well as a faculty member from UT, people from the Public Health Education Network, the Charitable Birth Services, the Black Doula Collective. So they're going to be talking about Black maternal health care in Knox County. So if you're interested, it's free and open to the public at 5:30. We also have at 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. in the School of Art and Architecture, right in the middle of campus. We have a talk by Eric Avery, who is a printmaker who works with his internationally known printmaker who works with medicine. And so he'll be talking about his art and how he weds medicine and medical concerns with art and printmaking. So with that said, I hope you could join us. And we also have events tomorrow. Look online where our website is online. We hope you could come. All the events are public and free. And I will turn it over to Deb to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks. And you can actually scan the QR code if you want to see the descriptions of the events or more information about the times and such. Yeah, yesterday was awesome. For those of you who were there, we had our talk on mortality, which was awesome, talking about people who research it from different aspects, whether it's what happens after somebody dies versus what is that emotions that they're going through as they're dying and how are they dealing with it. So it was really wonderful. And then we had David Haskell, which is a renowned author, talking about sound and the importance of sound and how it is impacting, whether it's too much sound or too little sound. And we're seeing these impacts throughout the environment. Really interesting. And then last night, this amazing musical performance about, there was a composer, a French composer who composed this piece of music while he was having surgery to remove a urinary bladder stone without anesthesia. Long time ago, now we do anesthesia, but that it was really awesome. So lots of wonderful things. This was a great collaboration with One Health Initiative and the Humanities Center, looking at One Health and the humanities portion of it, which is, I forget what somebody said last night, but it was amazing because they said, we are realizing and understanding and experiencing these things because of our humanity before we are reading about it in the research or anything. It's just something that we are experiencing, and this is a wonderful way to explore it. So with that, today we have Nancy Henry, who is in Amy's department. Nancy is the Nancy Moore Gosley Professor of English. She specializes in 19th century British literature and culture with particular interest in the realistic novel, women's writing, economics and finance, animal studies, equine studies, and the life and writing of George Eliot, or Mary Ann Evans. Her books include Women, Literature and Finance in Victorian Britain in 2018, The Life of George Eliot in 2012, and George Eliot and the British Empire in 2001. She is the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to George Eliot and Victorian Investments. She has also published numerous critical editions and articles, and she co-edits the Journal of Victorian Culture through Oxford and George Eliot, George Henry Lewis Studies through Penn State. She previously taught at Binghamton University and has degrees from Stanford and the University of Chicago. With that, I give you Dr. Henry.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks for the introduction. And greetings, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm delighted to be at the UT College of Veterinary Medicine, presenting work that's based in the humanities. My research and teaching, as you just heard, focuses on 19th century literature and culture, and I'm particularly excited about opportunities to speak with and to colleagues in the sciences, including veterinarians, as well as my students and colleagues in the humanities. I'd like to thank the UT Humanities Center for its support of my work and for organizing the One Health Humanities Days. I'd also like to thank English Department graduate student Emma Holleran, who has served as my research assistant for this talk. Building on the One Health Initiative idea that humans, animals, plants, and the environment are inextricably linked, with the health of one affecting the health of all, I'd like to share some of my research on the history and representation of equine health and medicine in the 19th century. The research is part of my book project called Horsepower: Horses in Victorian Literature and Culture. I have been researching and writing about horses in 19th century literature for several years now, and with a particular focus on horse accidents in 19th century British novels. In many of these novels, a horse accident marks a turning point in the plot, resulting in injury or death to the human or the horse. For example, in Charles Dickens's 1859 tale Two Cities, an aristocrat's carriage runs over and kills a poor child, setting the plot in motion. In George Eliot's 1861 Silas Marner, a young man takes his brother's horse to the local hunt and drunkenly attempts a jump, staking and killing the horse. In Thomas Hardy's 1891 Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the family cart horse Prince is killed by a speeding mail coach, casting the family into poverty. This aspect of fiction reflects reality at the time, and I'm interested in the physical and economic risks posed by driving and riding horses during a period when the equine population reached its peak, particularly in cities. It was only during the COVID-19 pandemic that I started to think about those risks in terms of disease and epidemics, as well as accidents. And this led me to begin investigating the history of veterinary medicine. As a literary scholar, I look to literature for representations of equine health and medicine that reflect a complicated history and help us to better understand that history. The representation of horses in 19th century literature generally, and the role of veterinary medicine specifically, is a surprisingly understudied topic. I'm excited to present some of my findings today, and I look forward to feedback from the audience. As a sidebar, I'm also honored to be speaking at the vet school. I have a little too much experience of the equine hospital next door, where my horse questionnaire spent almost 3 months in 2020. She's currently thriving, and I'll never be able to sufficiently thank the heroic equine veterinarians who have helped me to keep my horses healthy over the past 14 years. My experience with UT equine veterinarians has motivated me to learn more about the history of the profession. My presentation will have 2 parts. First, I'll briefly consider past cases of equine epidemics and that demonstrate the intertwined nature of equine and human health. The second part of the talk will focus on equine tail docking, which I believe illustrates the complex and contradictory attitudes towards equine health and well-being from the 18th century to the early 20th century. We might expect that this would be a story of progress and enlightenment, leading to ever better care of horses. But tail docking is especially interesting because even after being banned, the practice re-emerged and persisted despite objections that it was cruel. My overall argument is that equine health affected all aspects of society and culture in the 19th century, which was truly the century of the horse and the height of horsepower as a source of energy for transportation, agriculture, military engagement, and sports such as racing and fox hunting. Horses, along with donkeys and mules, were essential to industrialization, including the construction of railways, colonization, because in many cases, horses gave colonizers an advantage over indigenous populations, and westward expansion in the US, as we know from familiar images of stagecoaches and cowboys. Initially, the coming of steam-powered railways in the first half of the 19th century caused fears that horses and the humans who cared for them would be put out of business. Here, unemployed horses are seen busking, begging, and doing tricks for their grain above images of an early railway. Those fears were not realized. In fact, the coming of the railways created an almost insatiable need for more working horses. Their health was central to the economy, and their illnesses could be economically devastating. Furthermore, as horses were increasingly viewed as machines and disposable commodities, their treatment raised ethical questions that led to animal welfare reforms. It's important to recognize that modern veterinary medicine has a complicated history in which the veterinarian as professional in Britain only emerged in the late 18th century with the establishment of the Royal Veterinary College in London in 1791. While cattle breeders were important to the establishment of the first veterinary schools, horses were the primary focus, and development in equine care followed from the need to treat cavalry horses in the field and from the interests of wealthy breeders of thoroughbreds. The emergence of the veterinarian as a professional paralleled the rise of the human medical profession. Human doctors were instrumental in establishing the first veterinary schools. But handing over the treatment of animals to trained medical experts was surprisingly fraught, particularly with resistance from farriers and other untrained horse doctors. A debate arose about whether book learning in colleges could compare to the experience of those with a long tradition of treating animals and to whom knowledge was passed down informally rather than codified in textbooks. The battle was fought in publications and visual images. The vets attacked the farriers and the farriers attacked the vets. For example, a series of cartoons mocked the veterinary college in its early days. In this 18th century satirical print, a veterinary college professor is seen cropping the ears of a horse, a strictly cosmetic procedure that was briefly popular in the 18th century and which caused great pain to the horse. And you can see the blood is spilling down and the professor is dressed absurdly and, obviously not suited to the typical care of equines. In the US, the authority of veterinarians that we recognize today was only solidified after World War II. This is somewhat ironic given that the institutionalization of veterinary schools and credentialing of veterinarians coincided with the decline of horses as essential sources of power for transportation, agriculture, and warfare. The profession struggled for recognition, social standing, and trust in the face of prejudice. Historian Susan D. Jones writes that the duplicitous cigar-chomping horse doctor and the slovenly cow leech were stereotypes of animal healers, and such stereotypes had to be overcome. Attention began to shift away from horses to cattle and eventually to domestic pets, especially dogs and other small animals. Some of you will be familiar with James Herriot's All Creatures Great and Small, in which he recounts his life as a veterinarian in Yorkshire from the 1930s to the 1950s, and is called on to treat, well, all creatures great and small. Before this time, it was difficult for women to break into the profession for a variety of reasons, including the residual predominantly male 19th century culture of the stable, the perception that physical strength was needed to work with large animals, and even the unseemliness of performing procedures such as castration. The shift towards small animals opened a door for women in the second half of the 20th century. As our own veterinary college shows, the care of large animals, including equines, remains a crucial and vital field of research and practice today, and women are well represented. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, interest in the interrelationship of animal and human health has increased among scientists and medical experts, as well as historians and researchers in the humanities. For example, historian Sujit Sivasundaram's essay, The Animal, Human, and the Prehistory of COVID, argues for the need to decenter the human and center the animal. He writes, the interlocking crises of the pandemic and climate change call for a multi-species and even trans-species history that is about the assembly of various forms and things as generative of this change. In his 2022 book, Colonizing Animals, historian Jonathan Seha writes of his archival research, perhaps being everywhere, animals have been considered a mundane constant, part of the scenery of history, but not the plot. Increasingly, historians and literary critics are learning to view animals as part of the plot. In the 19th century, infectious outbreaks in horses were devastating for economies around the globe in ways that it's hard to imagine today. This is a reminder that horses remained the primary energy source in the Western world until the advent of the automobile in the 20th century. Horses continued to transport passengers and goods to and from railway stations, along country roads and city streets. The equine population in the US grew from 4.3 million in 1840 to 27.5 million by 1910, with similarly dramatic expansions in Britain and Europe. It's worth noting that in 1860, Tennessee's horse population numbered 290,882, according to the census, second only in the South to Texas. In 1872, an epidemic of equine influenza spread from Canada to the northeastern states and eventually to Chicago and then to the West Coast, debilitating or killing millions of horses. This epidemic brought daily life to a halt in ways that resonate eerily with our own recent pandemic shutdowns. Our colleague in the history department, Ernest Freeberg, writes in his 2020 book, A Traitor to His Species, Henry Bergh and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement, writes that this was in effect the nation's first energy crisis. It raised alarms about how dependent the expanding economy had become on horses as a source of energy. And the 1872 epidemic also stoked fears that the disease and its economic consequences would spread globally. As we've seen in the early 19th century, people fantasized erroneously that horses would be put out of work by railways. Over a generation later, humans facing a deadly epidemic imagined a city without horses, a dystopian fantasy that humans would need to pull the streetcars and omnibuses that were powered by horses. In fact, for a brief period, humans were pulling carts that horses would otherwise have pulled, though not quite to this degree, I expect. This image recalls the voyage to the Houyhnhnms in Jonathan Swift's 1726 Gulliver's Travels, suggesting anxieties about a world in which horses were not available to supply human needs, or more fantastically, that the role of horses and humans might be reversed. Such images constituted a genre, reflecting human fears about their reliance on horses and perhaps even guilt about how horses were used. So literature and art are able to ask, what if the tables were turned? And they have asked that. In response to the 1872 epidemic, reformers urged the need to rely less on vulnerable animals and more on steam engines to power the economy. According to historian Anne Norton Green, in the US, the progressive politics of the 1890s embraced efforts to replace horses on the grounds of sanitation and safety. Progressives attacked manure as a cause of disease, viewing pollution as dirt on the ground rather than smog in the air. Speaking of urban traffic accidents involving horses, one commentator proclaimed, "These frightful accidents can be prevented and the motor car will do it." The debate is important to remember and is ironic when we consider the toll vehicular traffic accidents take on our national health today, and as we face another transitional moment from fossil fuel burning vehicles to electric powered ones and even to self-driving cars. What was not that long ago viewed as a solution is now viewed as a problem. So this was the 19th century US context, but the cultural and economic impact of equine epidemics was felt around the world and hurried the adoption of fossil fuels. In his book, Powering Empire, historian On Barak writes, coal's rapid adoption in the Middle East was facilitated by the fact that between the 1780s and the 1810s, Egypt and other parts of the Mediterranean had experienced a series of epizootics that decimated their animal population. In her study of horses in 19th century colonial South Africa, Sandra Swart notes the prevalence of African horse sickness, a midge-borne illness that determined the settlement pattern of colonists. Roughly every 20 years, the disease became epidemic. Trying to keep horses healthy determined where the colonists settled and how colonial infrastructure was built. Horses were central to the plot of South African colonization. Another example is 19th century Sierra Leone, a British colony in West Africa plagued by insect-borne diseases. In the wake of colonial deforestation, the tsetse fly became a vector of diseases deadly to humans, horses, and cattle. Between 1856 and 1858, a mysterious epidemic wiped out the horse population of Sierra Leone. As in South Africa, Sierra Leone had to adapt to the impossibility of maintaining healthy horses and find other sources of energy. So fears that animal disease might spread and infect humans were prevalent throughout the 19th century. Humans felt vulnerable physically and economically. But until technology permitted a complete transition from horses to automobiles, the increase in the horse population led to the uneven development of veterinary medicine, which grew out of the ancient practice of farriery. Today, we think of farriers as experts on equine hoof health and shoeing. But prior to the emergence of veterinary science, farriers also treated the diseases of horses and cattle. Farriers became a target of veterinary professionalization discourse and were portrayed as uneducated purveyors of inherited folk knowledge. This tension between experience and formal training characterizes the history of veterinary medicine from the 18th through the early 20th centuries. In the 19th century, trained veterinarians were still rare, and people relied on folk remedies as they had for centuries. Freeburg writes of the 1872 epidemic, the small handful of trained veterinarians competed for the public's attention in business with crusading homeopaths, stable hands, rank opportunists, and even faith healers. The establishment of the veterinary profession was a response, both economic and humane, to the perception that farriers were incompetent to treat medical problems. In his book, From Farriery to Veterinary Medicine, LPQ writes, in the latter half of the 18th century, the suffering of sick animals in England, resulting from the gross ignorance of the farriers and other quacks in whose care they were put, was causing concern. And I did want to apologize if there are any farriers in the audience. I wasn't sure. This concern led to the founding of the Veterinary College in 1791. Here's how the college saw itself. Enlightening the veterinary professor is enlightening the farrier, and there's an allegorical figure of ignorance fleeing in the wake of the superior knowledge of the new veterinarian. So this is how they represented themselves, but here's how the college was satirized as a veterinary professor is seen forcing a medicine ball down the throat of a horse. Literature is instructive here and can add to our historical perspective. I've already mentioned George Eliot, the pseudonym of Marianne Evans, a realist novelist and chronicler of 19th century rural life. Her novels feature farriers and vets that are peripheral characters rather than central, but the attitudes toward them are revealing. For example, in Eliot's Silas Marner, a farrier accuses a butcher of slaughtering a cow that the farrier had drenched or treated for disease. The implication is that the butcher passed off bad meat to his customers. But the authority of the farrier is implicitly questioned, since drenching was a dubious form of treatment, more a catch-all attempt to cure a disease for which there was no established remedy. And the medicine ball in this image is kind of an example of such treatment. You know, just all kinds of like horrible things they stuff down the throats of animals in an attempt to cure diseases that were often not well understood. The human medical profession is a theme in Eliot's 1872 novel, Middlemarch, which includes an unscrupulous horse dealer, Mr. Bambridge, and his sidekick, Mr. Horrocks, known as the vet, a slang term which had little social or scientific standing at the time of the novel's setting in 1830. Horrocks colludes with Bambridge to sell a vicious horse named Diamond to an unwitting young man, Fred Vincy. Not only does Fred lose money when Diamond kicks out in the stall and lames himself, but Fred becomes ill from slogging through dirty stalls and almost dies. While this is not an example of transmission of disease from animals to humans, it suggests that the poor conditions in which horses were kept had implications for human health. Fred is treated by the young, ambitious Dr. Lydgate, who hopes to reform the human medical profession, but he runs into opposition from established older doctors, and his vision of reform, along with his career, are shattered. The older doctors make their living peddling useless tonics. And I think Eliot is making that connection between the fraud of human doctors, farriers who drenched animals, and the unscrupulous horse dealers masquerading as vets. In Charles Dickens's 1850 novel, David Copperfield, David's friend Tommy Traddles lives next door to the veterinary college in London's Camden Town, prompting the narrator to remark that the college was principally tenanted by gentlemen students who bought live donkeys and made experiments on those quadrupeds in their private apartments. The image of live donkeys in student apartments is humorous, but the reference to experiments on live animals invokes vivisection, a practice that spurred anti-cruelty activism in the 19th century. I'll also note here that in Barbara Kingsolver's 2022 novel, Demon Copperhead, a retelling of David Copperfield in contemporary Appalachia, including Knoxville, she updates this detail by having young men plan to buy sick horses at auction and sell them for meat. These examples of humans doing harm to horses brings me to the second part of my talk. While conducting research for a website on equine breeds and modern identity, which is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, I became fascinated by 18th century portraits of thoroughbreds with only stubs for tails. This is a sporting screen featuring 18th century equine portraits. It's held at the National Sporting Library and Museum in Virginia. On one side are European menage horses with long flowing tails. And I hope you can see this at least well enough to see that all of these European menage horses have beautiful tails. On the other side are British racehorses. And these are all 18th century British racehorses, famous ones. And if you can't see, here's a bit of a close-up on some of the panels. Where were their tails? Were they cut off to make the horses run faster? How did the horses keep off flies? I recalled Stephen Foster's Camptown Races, bet my money on the bobtail nag. I looked for a book on the history of tail docking, but there was none, so I decided to learn more. As a case study on equine health in historical perspective, I'd now like to focus on tail docking, or the cutting off of horses' tails, including amputation of the bone. This cruel custom came in and out of fashion in Britain from at least the 16th century through to the early 20th century, extending to the US, and drawing protests from authors such as William Gilpin in the 18th century, Anna Sewell in the 19th century, and John Galsworthy in the 20th. Tail docking was widely practiced in Britain in contrast to Europe. We saw the long flowing European horse tails, and it raises larger questions about how veterinarians and animal rights activists came up against the power of tradition, and also how deeply intertwined national identity was with the appearance of horses. To be clear, docking was not comparable to fashions in hairstyle, clothing, or tack. The operation of docking was brutal. Here is an image of the hatchet that was used for centuries next to the more modern invention. So basically they're like, just put it on a block and hack it off. And then later on, they came up with these other devices. Of course, there was no anesthesia. Here's a close-up of the more modern device. It turns out that tail docking has a strange and complicated history. As long as the practice has been going on, it's been called barbaric. Military men, veterinarians, and horsemen generally have protested against it as a cruel concession to fashion, except of course where it was medically needed due to infection or injury. The operation itself often resulted in infection and especially tetanus. I've read numerous veterinary manuals from the 18th through the early 20th century, and they all protest the cruelty of cutting off the tail. At the same time, they admit that it's almost universally practiced, and so they include instructions for how the act should be performed. The docking of horses in Britain is documented as early as 747 AD. In the medieval period in England, the cutting off of a horse's tail was something that people did as an act of revenge intended to punish and disgrace an enemy. The most notorious case was the mutilation of horses belonging to Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. The act was one of terror, defamation, and emasculation, a ritual with pagan origins, possibly imported into England by the Normans in 1066. Can't say for sure. It became so prevalent, appearing in Chaucer and Shakespeare, for example, that laws were passed against it as a property crime. Because at the time, long flowing tails were seen as beautiful and valuable. Here we see an image of Becket seemingly unaware that the man behind him is about to hack off his horse's tail with a knife. You see that? How did this practice transition from a crime committed on an animal and against a human enemy to a semi-medical procedure universally performed and justified as either practical or fashionable, especially from the 18th through the 20th centuries in the UK and the US? This transition from crime to fashion has been challenging to reconstruct, and I don't think I've really done it completely, but I'd like to keep trying. Although docking was condemned as cruel by Thomas Blundeville in 1566, in 1585, Gervase Markham proposed that the horse's back was strengthened by docking. I found evidence of this erroneous belief lingering as late as 1816 in a book called The Complete Farrier. Referring to docking as a compliance with custom which a horse was doomed to undergo, the author nonetheless trots out a justification, quote, "It is also supposed that it strengthens their backs, as the tail, by being shortened in this manner, requires less nutriment from the juices of the body." 1816, you know, that's quite a long time for a myth like that to persist. Historically, the dock tails of cavalry horses were a way to distinguish between English and French horses on the battlefield. It was possibly from military custom that tail docking moved into the realm of fashion, though it may also be that it was adopted by the military because it was fashionable. Again, hard to say. In 1761, Henry, 10th Earl of Pembroke, wrote, "I am not possessed of the English rage for cutting off all extremities from horses. I should be well pleased if the tails of our horses were left on." He says that the horses in the English cavalry are fretted and miserable and helpless against flies, while the foreign horses brush off the vermin and are cool and at ease. In this respect, no less than English national security is at stake when it comes to tail docking. Consequently, in 1764, docking was banned in the cavalry, but it was reintroduced in 1799. The main reason seems to be that the breeders were docking tails. Therefore, long-tailed horses were rare and expensive to purchase. This is a vicious circle, which resulted in dock tails being mandated again. Uniformity was required, and the military did not want to mount a cavalry in which some horses had tails and some did not, even if it meant that tailless horses suffered. Now, the 18th century was a low point for horses, as docking, nicking, or the cutting of the tail muscles to make them stand up here, and ear cropping became fashionable despite protests and the suspension of docking in the army. According to Sally Mitchell's 1985 analysis of equine art, docking was fashionable from 1700 to 1800. It became less fashionable from 1820 to 1859, possibly because in the 1830s, a theory arose that docking the tail interfered with the horse's movement. Docking all but disappeared from 1860 to 1880, after which it again became fashionable for hunters, but not racehorses. In the early 1900s, docking again became fashionable. She argues that after 1920, docking became unfashionable, and yet, as late as 1837, British novelist John Galsworthy wrote, "The reason for the dock tail is simply a senseless and hideous fashion. The sooner this lamentable custom is prohibited by law, the better." Describing country life in the 1930s and all creatures great and small, James Herriot refers casually to the ritual docking of foals each spring. Docking would not become illegal in Britain until 1949. Now, Mitchell's timeline is the most useful history of docking as a fashion that I've found, but it's based on equine portraits and therefore in the practices of the wealthiest horse owners. The written record suggests that docking among less wealthy horses had an equally uneven history. In a series of lectures on veterinary medicine given in the 1820s, William Percival writes, in England, it is customary to dock all but the cart horses, and generally at an earlier period. He notes that once the horse is docked by its breeder, it's often docked again after purchase, according to the prevailing fashion or preference of the owner. He states, a practice seemingly introduced by fashion has become established by custom, and we are often called upon to put it into execution. Again, this is the notion that the vets, they don't like it, they think it's cruel, but they can't buck the trend, and so they feel that they must do what they're asked to do. Like many professional veterinarians throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, Percival stresses the cruelty of docking and its prevalence, but he is resigned to his need to perform it. He proceeds to give a horrifying description of how docking is practiced. The tailbone is cut off, blood spurts out, and the wound is cauterized. He writes, the animal will often literally shriek in agony, and really in the present unskillful and barbarous manner in which that terrific veterinary surgical instrument, the red-hot iron, is made use of, I do not know what can excite more exquisite and poignant pain. Here's a final cartoon of a veterinary professor teaching students to dock tails, and it's pretty, you guys didn't want me to use this image on the poster because it might scare people away. And this is, again, the professor and teaching students, and meanwhile the horse is screaming in pain. Percival thinks that docking detracts from the symmetry of the horse and that there is something really indecent about the unnatural nudity of those parts. The prudish comment about indecency apart, the argument that docking interferes with the natural beauty of the horse was echoed throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Percival implores his readers to be humane, saying that if the horse could in language report upon them, he would accuse them, and with great justice, of cruelty grafted upon prejudice. Percival concludes, one would think we were a profession of savages. 50 years later, Anna Sewell's 1877 novel, Black Beauty, did give voice to the horse. In that novel, the former warhorse, Sir Oliver, complains, they cut off my long, beautiful tail through the flesh and through the bone and took it away. Sir Oliver argues that docking is against God's plan. There was not a well-bred young horse in my time that had not his tail docked in some shameful way, just as if the good God that made us did not know what we wanted and what looked best. Sir Oliver says, thank heaven they do not do it now. Black Beauty was written in 1877, when docking was allegedly out of fashion, but Samuel Sidney's 1873 Book of the Horse notes that docking was coming back into fashion in the 1870s. I'm sure Anna Sewell would have been shocked that it would return as a predominant fashion at the end of the century. In Anthony Trollope's 1880 novel, The Duke's Children, the Duke of Omnium remarks that every horse has a head and that every did have tails until they were ill-used is the extent of my stable knowledge. And various forms of docking were fashionable at the end of the 19th century, as this image of women riders in the US shows. This is meant to be a spoof on the fashion. This is one fashion now out of fashion. This is the current fashion. Quite the thing, 1888. An 1895 article in the British Medical Journal observed that more than 90% of all horses in Great Britain are subjected to the operation, which was opposed by the RSPCA. For centuries, there was a tension between docking's alleged practicality and its perceived cruelty as mere fashion. Some would argue that there was a practical utility of docked tails in terms of keeping manure and other debris from collecting in carriage horse tails when the horses were in harness or stabled, especially in tight urban quarters. And this is actually an illustration from Black Beauty showing a horse with a tail being put into a harness. This, however, would not be true of thoroughbreds and hunters who were otherwise carefully tended, and it was not true of European horses. Elaborate efforts were made to protect docked horses from insects, as this 19th century fly net shows. In 2007, in a 2007 article reviewing the literature on tail docking by a team of Belgian scientists in the journal Animal, observes a clear documentation precisely detailing the reasons for docking is very difficult to find. And I've also found this to be true. Whenever a practical justification is given for it, like it gets tangled in the harness or it can't keep clean, objections also arose that there was no practical justification. So people were debunking these justifications in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and then continuing to make them, continuing to object to them. It's, in short, the historical record of docking is full of contradictions. I hope I've at least impressed that on you. In conclusion, while equine health does not have the same economic implications today as it did in the 19th century, equine medicine is a vital part of the subcultures of pleasure riding, showing, and racing. Outbreaks of equine diseases still plague barns, and equine medicine is an essential part of our own university ecosystem. An awareness of the relationship between human and animal diseases can alert us to the representations of animals and human medicine in literature and culture. At the same time, the call to decenter the human and center the animal in historical research can shed light on a variety of contemporary issues relating to disease, the environment, and human-animal relations. While we can never go back to the biopower of horses to fuel modern economies, studying the specific ways in which people talked about the need to replace horses with fossil fuels, spurred by epidemics and the danger of pollution, provides historical perspective on how we talk about the need to make a transition from fossil fuels to more sustainable forms of energy. Today, we see the irony of proposing fossil fuel consumption as a remedy for pollution or motor cars as a remedy for traffic accidents, but the era during which horses were the main source of energy is valuable to study as we make our own energy transition. I focused on tail docking because it is so evident in the visual record of equine portraiture, and yet it is rarely ever mentioned or explained. The history of the practice is contradictory and controversial. I call it a form of cosmetic surgery in which the subject of the surgery has no ability to consent. Recent articles on the practice conclude that it serves no purpose for the horse. The article by Belgian scientists concludes docking is of no benefit to animals, and the advantages for humans should be profitably reconsidered. Animal cruelty in the tradition of tail docking still haunts the horse industry, from the drugging of racehorses to the soring of Tennessee walking horses. While we would like to think that the history of equine health is one of continuous progress, and in most ways it is, the efforts of medical professionals and anti-cruelty reformers continue to come up against entrenched traditions and economic interests. The end. Thank you. Looks like we have a
Question. So do you plan, I mean, I have to say I'm a little depressed about how little progress we're actually making. I just an hour ago had a pit bull with mutilated ears in my exam room, and you can plug in declawing cats and tail docking dogs a little different. But what about setting? It's still so common to see standard breds, saddle breds, Tennessee walkers have their tail broken and set. So I
don't know anything about the tradition of that. I don't know whether that's something that arose as docking fell.
I mean, it's all cosmetic, right?
Yeah.
It's one of these things that I still feel like we're hearing large animal veterinarians say, I have to keep doing this because I mean, you could just plug in everything that was said in the 1700s, that it's going to be done. We're going to try to do it as safely as possible because the trainers will do it. They will absolutely do it.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm here giving this talk, to get some more perspective on what is actually going on today. But I agree, studying the history is really depressing because you just see it coming back, and you realize that all along people knew it wasn't. Yeah. So these shifts in fashion, I don't know. Maybe other people have thoughts about why these fashions, that are so cruel, how people can continue to justify them.
Well, and cattle. they dock the tails in cattle
And
too.
pigs and
Because,
castrate them,
right,
yeah.
and it's always hygienic. It's more hygienic for them.
For them. Yeah.
sheep.
But it's the same thing. It doesn't, it's not right. I worry, it's like.
Yeah, in the case of horses it's just a little more complicated because of the fashion element to it. I had the quotation up there about how, individual riders felt their identity bound up with the appearance of the horse, and therefore you would no more appear on a horse with a tail when tails were not popular, than you would show up dressed and out of fashion. So yeah, I mean, it's all cruel, but and horses being so central to every aspect of the culture in 18th, 19th century really makes it interesting and complicated and depressing. Oh, Amy.
Do we know anything about the aesthetics that, I have a dog who, by the time we got her, her tail was docked and her dew claws were pulled out, and there's deep memory. The animals remember it, they forever. But I can't understand, like, even one step further back than you're doing, like, what is the criteria of aesthetics that makes this beautiful or makes this, we could say it's an aesthetic choice or it's fashion, but where did that, what is the criteria for that aesthetic?
I haven't found anything.
I have an
about
insight on modern.
Yeah.
So like Arabians, saddlebreds, like you want them, because think about it, what does an excited horse look like? Tail straight up. So they fake that with that
It's
tail.
spirited.
So it's spirit.
And it's the opposite in cases of quarter horses, when you nerve the tail. So you completely destroy the nerve endings to the tail, because in the Western world, the deader the better. So you don't want them in the show ring flicking their tail, looking spirited, because you want them to be dead broke.
So
So it depends
it's about
on,
human power.
Yeah.
And the pit bull, of course, it's a machismo thing, but I'm staring at you, I'm tough. So they artificially create that. So again, I'm not seeing that here.
Thankfully, the ear cropping did not come back. The ear cropping of
that is
horses.
bizarre. I have no
That
idea.
had its moment, and then I think they realized that was just ridiculous.
Yes.
I'm just thinking back of some of the illustrations that you showed of cropped horses and then their owners, and the owners are perfectly groomed, and so are the horses. So it makes me wonder if part of the aesthetic of that is simply the groomedness of an animal that is wild otherwise. I mean, it's just to be as if to have a stylized, horse
Haircut.
is somehow part of a broader fashion investment that links to things like clothing and,
It does,
and
it does,
hairstyle.
and that Sally Mitchell book is invaluable, because she sort of surveys the whole history of equine portraiture and shows how the fashions changed. But, just how can these people who presumably care about their horses, how could they put them through it as part of what, I mean, you don't see any evidence in the beautiful portraits of it's only in the cartoons that you see the blood spurting out, which I'm sure is, well, from what I've read, is exactly what happened. Yes.
Kind of jumping onto that, was this an expensive procedure? Like, how expensive was this to do?
I mean, I think that's gonna depend on when and where. If the breeder just hacks it off after the colt is born, the foal is born, then obviously that's not gonna cost very much. If you have to call in a veterinarian, I'm sure the richer you were, the more expensive the procedure would be. But I think the idea that of people just doing their own horses was to save money. And that's why you get veterinarians saying, well, better we should do it than you should do it. So I honestly don't know. I didn't put a monetary value on it. I think probably it wasn't that expensive of a procedure to do. And it was something that people were often tempted just to do on their own, especially if they were, if someone was, a breeder was selling horses to the military, for example, they could just save a lot of money just doing it themselves. I don't know, does that,
No,
I
yeah,
wish I had like a ballpark.
I was just wondering, you know, if that becomes a monetary kind of symbol, if it's an expensive procedure. Like, for instance, if you have a horse that you have to work, you probably don't have time to have it heal, and you don't have time, you can't let it, you have to have a vet, and you have to have someone who's taking care of it. That's something visually different, as a status symbol from maybe a lower class person. So that's why I was wondering if it is more expensive or even logistically different, and that it might be part of that as well.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And when you add it to the cropped ears for a while, and also the pulled manes, which I didn't really talk about, you know, would be a kind of a time consuming, like a show that you could afford a groom who could, you know, be taking care of the horse all the time. Yeah. Yeah, but docking is so interesting because you just sort of find it, eventually you find it all across the spectrum, not only in the wealthy horse owners, and then you start to get the practical justifications. So, you know, it's a cab horse, it's got its tail off. So yeah, it's hard to just find a through line, really, in the history. Missy?
So I'm dealing with my feelings right now. And I was drawn to the way that agency functioned in this argument, you know, that saying, well, we think it's cruel, but we have to, because if we don't, it will be worse. And I wonder if there's a way to feed that, the perversity of that logic back through the fashion part of the argument. And where I'm going with this is thinking about when it ebbs and flows and what human fashion looks like in those moments. You know, we have the advent of the empire waist dress, which, you know, from just a sort of safety of human organs point of view is much better, especially for pregnant women. You know, are there any correlations or like human experiences of restriction, of sort of the torture of the body via fashion that would help to make sense of this? I wouldn't expect there to be a correlation, but you are looking at some extraordinarily corseted moments, especially in women's fashion, but also in men's, and then changes, like just your sort of experience of what
Yeah,
it means to be presented.
there is a book called The Cult of the Horse, by a literary critic named Gina Dore, who does talk about parallels between things like corsets and other constraining devices used on horses, like the bearing rein. And she does sort of equate it to various forms of patriarchal control, essentially. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. And kind of like back to Amy's question about like why are these things appealing? I mean, I guess we know for a woman to have a small waist was appealing in one generation and less appealing in another, but I don't know, Amy, how do you?
Yeah.
We need a.
Yeah, these are the mysteries.
That's.
Do you have any evidence besides the sort of medieval Thomas Becket moment that would suggest that sort of, you know, from that moment up to the 18th century? And again, I realize the book hasn't been written and you're kind of writing it in a way, which is fantastic.
Yeah, there is a gap there. I mean, I know that practice of hacking off your enemy's horses' tails, like, you know, continued
Yeah.
in the medieval period. And like I said, there were laws like property crimes against it. But yeah, there is a gap, because then I didn't really start. I read some like 16th century manuals, and that's where the whole theory of you know, oh, it strengthens the horse's back, which is a whole different, you know, justification for it. But yeah, there are gaps in my I don't know if it's even so much in, you know, Emma, in my research is just in the record, you know.
Right,
I
right.
think it's going to take a lot more digging because people didn't tend to just write about docking. It comes up in other contexts, you know.
Is again, just as a follow-up, the velocity of fashion change, you know, it's exponential once we get to the 18th century, and that has to do with things like print technology and colonialism and, you know, practices of import and export. Like fashion changes faster, it just does. And that punch cartoon was just great on that, you know, like the difference between 1885 and 1888, you know, ooh. And of course, now we have an experience of a velocity of fashion and of, you know, both in clothing and in other styles that's mind blowing, right? You know, like how fast citational practices work.
And
And
in
so,
pets and in how pets
Yeah,
are.
yeah. And I wonder if that velocity is a piece of unraveling, you know, the mystery here.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
why the up and down in the back.
Definitely think about that. Also, just as I mentioned, the whole British versus the French or versus the European. I mean, I think like the French and the Italians are kind of horrified that the English are cutting off their horses' tails. And I think there was there kind of arose this sense in the British upper class, at least, that, you know, these long flowing tails are effeminate. Right. And it was kind of funny to think that, you know, the docked tail would be masculine. But you know, this is the impression that I get. You know, because I mean, I remember reading somewhere that like no Italian would be seen riding a horse that didn't have a beautiful, you know, flowing tail. That was their point of pride.
And that continues today too with other animals. The Europeans will not, you know, dock or straighten ears of animals. It's against the law. And so this docking of tail and straightening ears is a very American, North American phenomenon. And there's something about nationhood. There's something about, I liked what you said about your enemy, making your enemy impotent in some way by stealing the horse's tail, and how that's like a potential submerged or sedimented value that continues into the fashion in some way would align with what Misty was saying about corseting your women, you know, and restricting, you know, for power. I don't know. I don't think it's answerable, but
Right.
it's.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's Donna Landry writes about different like, you know, seats, different styles between the European and the English, and I mean, and lots of other aspects of horsemanship and equestrianism that were that had national connotations. You know, this is we do what we do because we're not the French. You know?
I think plays into why we in this country still allow all the barbaric practices that have been completely outlawed in the UK, because we're not the UK. We are America. We're not gonna let the government tell us what to do. And that's a very American thing. And I think a lot of the pushback.
So we do have two questions from the online folks. They've kind of touched on already with other questions, but the first one says, fabulous talk. How does the historical docking of horses' tails compare to the practice among other smaller animals? Also, what do people do with the removed hair and muscle?
Well, you know, we've already had a veterinarian weigh in on the fact that you know, I don't know much about the history of dog ear docking and tail docking, but I think, you know, the kind of relevant point right now is that it is still going on in the same way that docking.
It would kind of be interesting to see, because it came from the UK. These
Ear-
breed
animal
dogs.
dog ear
Yeah,
docking.
is there some sort of parallel with the hunting dog?
Well, I can tell you that in 1877 in Black Beauty, with the Sir Oliver, who's complaining that he had his tail cut off, also talks about, he's like, it's like what they do to the poor little dogs, you know, and that was 1877. And so point being, Anna Sewell was already equating like what was being done to dogs and horses.
The other question says, fascinating presentation. Do you have any opinions, insight, or observations related to what could be considered as current fashionable equine trends? For example, maybe a beefed up quarter horse bred for showing compared to a more standard horse, or are deviations breed-wise today strictly functional?
No, so they're not at all. Not at all functional.
No.
Not at all functional.
Okay, that is from the horse's
It's people's mouths.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it's a great question, and you know, the question of
they-
setting and
Are
settings.
they able to hear? Are they able to hear when they're talking? Okay.
So, yes, they said yes.
I'm mindful of the time, but
You're fine. Any other questions?
This is a question on the other part of your talk. I'm just interested in the influenza and just thinking about all of the different illnesses which I assume in Africa was not necessarily influenza, but other
Right.
kind of epidemic diseases. Given the proliferation of human epidemics at that time, are these entirely separate spheres? Are there examples at all of transmission from horses to humans at any point in this? I suspect the answer is no. But I don't know.
well, again, if there are any, vets in the audience might be better qualified to answer, but I think my impression is that I don't know about transmission from horses to humans, but there were like humans and horses were vulnerable to similar kind of diseases that were spread by insects. But then some of the diseases were only affected the horses, right? So yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have to take it as a case, but I'm bringing together research from completely different historians, and it may be that there's more people have done more comprehensive comparative studies, but from what I could tell, you have to look at the specific case. Yes.
One question I had is, in terms of the philosophical and theological understanding of, at the time of horses in pain or animals in pain. I guess my question is, like, for instance, we still boil lobsters alive, right? Because we're like, okay, they don't have pain, and then there's other evidence coming out about that. I guess that would be one question was there a idea that animals, philosophically, theologically, don't have a soul, don't have pain or something like that, that relates to this kind of larger issue of perception of animals?
I mean, the answer is yes. And, if you're talking about the whole, if you go back to Descartes, kind of argue that animals were machines, and there will always be people arguing that animals don't feel pain. But clearly people who worked with horses, as opposed to the philosophers who might be theorizing this, knew that horses felt pain. So like I did quote one early 19th century veterinarian who talked about the horse screaming in pain. And so I don't know, I mean, my impulse to say is that I don't think those philosophies were necessarily trickling down to the people who were practicing tail cutting. I think they just didn't care.
I guess with kind of a follow-up with that, if the vets and some of the farriers were saying, yeah, this is a cruel practice, but the elites, the people reading the philosophy, are not under that same persuasion understanding, potentially that could be something the elites and upper social class may have this perception, because they do not work with the animals in the same way as the farriers or the vets.
Yeah, no, honestly, I need to learn more about that, because I think maybe like 16th, 17th century, there are really important manuals for horsemanship that I think do draw on philosophy and theology, but I just am not that familiar with them. So it's a really interesting question. I don't see it coming up so much in the 19th century, because by that time, I think most people would agree that horses could feel pain, even if they would disagree about lobsters or other kind of things. There definitely was a hierarchy of animals, people's understanding, valuing animals.
I'll just make one comment back to the zoonotic part of it. When you talked about the people who worked cleaning up after the horses would get sick too. I think about like salmonella or something, that it could be, something like that, maybe not a direct transmission, but
Yeah. Sanitary reform, of course, was hugely important.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody.